I didn't answer the first call. I saw my daughter's name on the screen and felt the air in my lungs change, like the room itself had leaned in, listening. 3 rings. 4. Then the call ended, and the silence was worse than any voice. My heart did something strange. Not panic, not fear. Something sharper. Recognition. I dialed back. She answered on the second ring, breathless, like she'd been running. "Dad," she said, and the word sounded like it was breaking in half. "Dad, hurry, please." "Where are you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, because I didn't know what I was going to do with the truth once it arrived. "Grandpa's, he's bricking brother in." My stomach dropped. I didn't understand at first. I heard the words and felt them pass through me like a knife through fabric. I saw a wall. I saw cement. I saw my son trapped behind it. My car keys slipped in my hand. "Where are you?" I repeated. "Home," she sobbed. "I'm in the living room. Dad, he's got a trowel. He's mixing cement. He's putting it in the wall." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I let the silence stretch, because I needed the moment to make sense. I heard her inhale, a shaky breath that sounded like surrender. "Dad," she whispered, "please hurry." The road blurred under the tires. The world narrowed to the stretch of asphalt and the image of my son's eyes. I drove on the sidewalk. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I cared about the sound of my daughter's voice, the panic in it, the way it had stripped my bones clean. I reached the house in a minute that felt like an hour. The front door didn't stand a chance. I slammed my shoulder into it. Wood splintered. The lock gave. The door swung inward with a crash that echoed in my chest. Inside, my father-in-law stood in the hallway like he'd been waiting for me. He was holding a trowel in one hand, a brick in the other. Cement smeared his fingers. Only my son's eyes were visible. He was buried up to his neck in fresh mortar, his face pale, his mouth open in a silent scream that hadn't yet formed into sound. My father-in-law looked at me with a calm that didn't belong to a man who'd just tried to kill his grandson. He smiled. "Sit down," he said, as if I was a guest in his home. My daughter's crying filled the room like a low, constant hum, and my father-in-law said softly, "You should have listened sooner." I stood there watching him, listening to my own heartbeat. The betrayal wasn't in the bricks. It was in the way he said should, because I knew that tone. That tone belonged to someone who had been right all along. I'd never trusted him. Not completely. But I had married into his family. I'd thought I could manage it. I'd thought I could keep the peace. I'd thought he was a man who liked control. But this was something else. This was the kind of control that didn't need permission. I looked at my wife's empty seat at the table. She wasn't here. She'd left before I arrived. She'd been gone for years in the ways that mattered. And I hadn't noticed. Not really. Because I'd been busy being a husband, a father, a man who believed he knew what was happening in his own house. My daughter's voice was breaking. "Dad," she said, he's doing it. He's bricking him in." My father-in-law's smile widened, like he'd been waiting for me to realize something, like he'd been waiting for me to be alone. "Do you want to know why?" he asked, as if this was a conversation we'd been having for years. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because the answer was already in my mind, in the quiet corners of my memory where I'd buried things. I remembered the first time my wife's phone had buzzed in the middle of the night. I remembered her quick glances, the way she turned the screen down, the way she smiled without looking at me. I remembered thinking it was nothing, just a work message, just a friend, just a silly thing. But it wasn't. It never was. I remembered the day I found her journal. Not by accident, because I'd been looking, because something in me had begun to suspect. I'd found her handwriting in a notebook that wasn't hers. A list of names, a list of dates, and beside one of the dates, a phrase. "He's mine." I'd stared at it until my eyes hurt. I'd told myself it was nothing, that I was paranoid, that I was imagining betrayal because I was tired, because I was insecure, because I wanted something to blame. But I had kept the notebook. I'd kept it like a piece of evidence in a case I hadn't yet admitted existed. I'd kept it because I didn't want to be wrong, and because I didn't want to be right. My wife came home late that night. I'd asked her about the notebook. She'd laughed, a soft, controlled laugh. "You're reading things that aren't there," she'd said. And I'd believed her, because I wanted to, because I needed to, and because it was easier to live in a lie than to walk into the truth. But the truth was waiting, and it had always been waiting. My father-in-law's voice cut through my thoughts. "You know," he said, "your son isn't your son." My blood went cold. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I just looked at him, my mind moving, quietly, like a knife sliding into place. "You're wrong," I said. He smiled again. "I'm not wrong," he said. "You just haven't seen what I've seen." He lifted the trowel. The cement was still wet. The smell of it filled the air like a poison. "You should have known," he said. I left the house that night with my daughter in my arms. I left my son behind. I left him in the wall, not because I wanted him dead, because I needed the truth to stay where it was, inside. Because I needed to see who would move first. Because I needed to know if the family I'd married into was built on lies. I drove to the hospital. I drove to the police. I drove to a lab. I did everything quietly. I did it without screaming, without accusing, without making a scene, because I knew that the moment I showed my anger, I'd lose. I knew that the moment I showed my pain, they'd see it as weakness, and I wasn't weak. I was calculating. I was patient. I was waiting for the moment when the truth would be undeniable. The DNA report arrived 2 days later. I opened it at the kitchen table. The paper was crisp. The numbers were clear. The result was a clean, brutal sentence. Not related. My son was not mine. My son was not my blood. My wife had lied. My father-in-law had known. He had known for years. He had watched me raise a child that wasn't mine, and he had decided that the punishment for that lie was this: a wall, a trowel, cement, a slow, deliberate burial. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just sat there, letting the words sink in like stones. Then I called my wife. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Hello," she said. I didn't say anything. I just held the report in my hand. The paper trembled slightly. I knew she could hear it. "I know," I said finally. Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" she asked. I looked at the wall in my mind. I pictured my son's eyes. I pictured my father-in-law's smile. I pictured my wife's calm face. And I felt something shift, a cold, controlled satisfaction. "You didn't think I'd find out," I said. Her voice broke. "No," she whispered. You were wrong," I said. Then I hung up. I went back to the house. I walked in through the front door like I owned the place. My father-in-law was sitting at the table. He was calm. He was smug. He was waiting. He looked up when I entered. "You're back," he said. I sat down across from him. I set the DNA report on the table. He stared at it. His smile faltered. I watched him. I watched him shrink. I watched the control leave his face. He didn't speak. Because he knew what I was going to say. Because he knew he had lost. I leaned forward. My voice was quiet. I made it soft. I made it almost gentle. "I know," I said. He swallowed. His eyes flicked to the wall. To my son, to the cement, to the crime he'd committed. He tried to speak. He couldn't. I stood up. I walked past him. I went to the wall. I put my hand on the cement. It was still warm. It was still fresh. My son's eyes stared back at me from behind it. He was alive, but he was trapped. And I knew, with a clarity that felt like a blade, that I could never trust this family again. I turned away. I walked out of the house. I left my father-in-law sitting at the table. I left my wife waiting for my return. I left my son in the wall. Not because I wanted to abandon him, but because I wanted the world to see what betrayal looks like. Because I wanted them to understand that lies have consequences. Because I wanted them to feel the same helplessness I had felt. And because I wanted to make sure that, when they finally freed him, They would remember who built the wall. I never went back. Not to the house. Not to the family. Not to the life I thought I had. I left the city. I left the name. I left the illusion. My daughter is with me now. She sleeps at night, but she still wakes sometimes, screaming as if she's trapped inside a wall. I hold her. I listen to her breathe. And I think about the way my father-in-law smiled. The way he said, "You should have listened sooner." I didn't listen, but I learned. I learned the truth. And the truth is a kind of power. A quiet, brutal power. One that doesn't need a voice. One that doesn't need a weapon. One that simply exists and waits.